There was a time when space exploration was viewed as impossible. Roughly 100 years ago, people would have thought you were mad if you proposed a mission to the moon. They would have asked how in the world you could send a person into the vast unknown and return him or her safely to Earth. When the topic was explored in books, it was placed in the realm of pure science fiction. In 1901, H.G. Wells, the renowned author of The War of the Worlds, published The First Men on the Moon, a story about two men who build a spaceship and travel to the moon. And though his novel was categorized as pure fiction, Wells was convinced that space travel would one day be possible. Now, not only is space exploration possible, it's taken for granted. Because of the advancements in science, we were able to witness the first successful moon landing in 1969, which was a new beginning for all of us. And by analogy, it is the advancements in science that have allowed us to cross into the boundary of death and explore it. This is the crux of resuscitation science, the science of bringing people back to life after death. And this may sound impossible, as if we're veering into pure science fiction, but it is not. It is very real. Sam Parnia, Erasing Death. Hello, and welcome back to the Sheol podcast. My name's Justin Toppins, and I am thrilled to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying our content and you want to stay up to date with our latest episodes, we kindly ask that you consider liking and subscribing to our show. By doing so, you'll be supporting our podcast and helping us reach more people just like you. So, if you find our conversations informative, entertaining, enjoyable, we greatly appreciate your support. I want to thank you for tuning in, and really hope you enjoy today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Sheol podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a little-known phenomenon known as shared death experience. Now, anecdotal evidence suggests that some loved ones and caregivers of dying patients undergo a type of end-of-life phenomenon known as a shared death experience, whereby one feels that one has participated in the dying person's transition to post-mortem existence. Anecdotal evidence also suggests that shared death experiences can have a range of profound psycho, spiritual, and emotional effects. However, shared death experiences have been all but ignored in hospice and palliative medicine. And this leaves professional bereavement services uninformed about shared death experiences, which is one of the reasons we want to focus on a story involving shared death experiences on today's episode. Now, shared death experiences come from a variety of sources. Soldiers watching comrades die on the battlefield, hospice nurses, people holding death vigils at the bedsides of their loved ones, all tell stories with the same message. Some people don't die alone. Some somehow find a way to share their passage to the other side with someone else. Raymond Moody coined the term shared death experiences after spending over 20 years collecting stories about the afterlife. Raymond Moody introduced the concept of shared death experiences to the public conscience in his 2009 book, Glimpses of Eternity. He first started collecting stories of people who died and returned to life while he was in medical school. Skeptics dismiss these tales of afterlife experiences as hallucinations triggered by anesthesia or anoxia or lack of oxygen to the brain, but Raymond Moody was adamant that you could not explain away shared death experiences by citing hypoxia or anesthesia. Why? Well, Dr. Moody says that you don't have the option in a shared death experience because bystanders aren't ill or injured, and yet they can experience the same kind of things as people who undergo near-death experiences. And it's worth noting that based on Dr. Moody's research, the accounts of shared death experiences don't just come from bereaved family members or close friends. Some healthcare workers at the bedsides of dying patients report seeing light exit from the top of a person's body at the moment of death. It's worth noting that not everyone agrees with Dr. Moody. Sean Carroll, a physicist who has participated in public debates about the afterlife with Moody, says that life after death is dramatically incompatible with everything we know about modern science. He goes on to say that people who claim the soul exists after death would have to answer several questions. What particles make up the soul? What holds them together? How does it interact with ordinary matter? Skeptics like Sean Carroll would consider near-death experiences and shared-death experiences simply legends and sketchy claims from what he would call unreliable eyewitness accounts. Still, over the years, the number of cases, not just of near-death experiences, shared-death experiences, and terminal lucidity continue to grow as people feel more and more confident that they can share their story without losing credibility. And with all that in mind, let's get into the story of Jeffrey Olsen. Jeffrey C. Olsen was born on December 1st, 1957 in Logan, Utah. He grew up in a family of 11 children and spent most of his childhood in rural Idaho. He attended Ricks College in Rexburg, Idaho, and later transferred to Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Here, he earned a bachelor's degree in accounting. He experienced a great deal of success in marketing. He started his career as an accountant at KPMG, one of the largest professional service companies in the world. He later joined the executive team at SkyWest Airlines, a regional airline based in St. George, Utah, where he served as the CFO and COO. And it was while attending college that Jeffrey met his wife, Tamara. They quickly fell in love, had 2 children, and by all accounts, had an extremely happy life together. But in 1997, right after a visit with Tamara's family, everything in Jeff's life would change. This is how Jeff describes the accident that changed his life forever.
Speak of it now. We went to visit her family on Easter. We had a beautiful Easter gathering, family dinners. The kids colored Easter eggs. We did all the traditional things that we had done. And it was the Monday following Easter that we were headed home. It was about a 5-hour drive. And I had buckled the kids in their car seats, and we had said goodbye to everybody, and I loaded the luggage in the back of the car, and it was interesting. And I'll share this. As we were pulling away from the curb, Tamara stopped me. She said, "Stop, wait." I thought she'd forgotten something.
Yeah.
And I stopped the car, and she said, "I just need to go say goodbye to Mom and Dad one more time." And she jumped out of the car. I noticed how she ran up, and she not only hugged them both, but she kissed them both.
Oh, wow.
Which wasn't necessarily uncommon, but I noticed it. And then she joyfully came running back to the car and jumped in. And, in the moment I thought, gosh, women, we've already said goodbye. Let's get on the road. But in hindsight, and that's why I bring it up, she must have had a knowing. Some little whisper said, "Stop, wait, I've got to go hug Mom and Dad one more time." And she honored that. I mean, this is the type of person she was. I mean, we all get those whispers. And I bring this up because we've got to honor that. Wow, I make that phone call, give that hug, say that I love you, give that apology, send that text, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But she got that message. I'm going to go say goodbye one more time. And as the day rolled out, that was the last goodbye.
Wow.
So, yeah, she jumps back in the car, she buckles up, I get on the interstate, I crank the cruise control up to 75 miles an hour. And I'm hurrying. 75 miles an hour is as fast as I could legally go. I wanted to get back to work. I was going to miss most of Monday, and that would put me behind, and all of those things that...
Sure.
I've learned not to beat myself up too much about it. It's being a man. You're a provider. You got to get it done. You got to put your pants on and go to work. Yeah. And yet all that was going on. And yet there was a moment that I just glanced in the rearview mirror to look at traffic. And in that moment, I noticed Griffin, my youngest son. I just saw him, and he was sound asleep in his car seat. But it's like time just stopped. I mean, I looked at him and I thought, what a beautiful kid. Mm-hmm. I mean, we were told we may not have more children, and there he is, our miracle boy. And even in this glance, I noticed details. I noticed how long his eyelashes were. And then I heard Spencer, my oldest son, playing in the seat behind me. He had gotten little Star Wars action figures for Easter, and he was having the grandest lightsaber battle, in the universe. And I just thought, what a beautiful kid. I mean, I felt the joy of my children. And then I looked over at Tamara, who had also reclined her seat back, and she was sound asleep. But she was still holding on to my hand. And I had this profound moment of gratitude. I thought, wow, we're 10 years into a marriage, 2 beautiful sons, we're pursuing our careers, and she's still holding my hand. Like she did when I had $2 extra and took her to a $1 movie in college, anyway, there was this profound moment of gratitude. Just like, wow, look at what I'm surrounded with. How do I deserve this?
Right.
And it was an hour after that it all came apart. And there was reports of crosswinds. There was reports of a red pickup truck driving erratically on the interstate. I think, and this may be the toughest part of the story, I believe I may have just dozed off, just for a second. We'd been up late doing Easter stuff and with family and games and talking, and you're working those 14 and 16-hour days as a man, just trying to make it. Anyway, I may have dozed off, Eric. I believe I may have just nodded off. And then swerved to the right, overcorrected to the left, and I lost control of the car. And then the car began to roll, not off the road, but down the road at 75 miles per hour. And it was a horrible accident. I mean, the reports say it probably rolled no less than 6 or 8 times at that high speed. I blacked out for most of that. But when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. And the first thing I heard was Spencer, my 7-year-old, crying hysterically in the back seat. And as a father, I thought, I got to get to him. I got to get to my boy,
Right.
But that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned. I couldn't tell if it was the seat or the floorboard. There was the rancid smell of gasoline, all the broken glass. I was unaware of my injuries. What had actually happened is both of my legs had been crushed and shattered. In fact, the left leg was eventually amputated above the knee.
Wow.
My back had been broken in 2 places, but ironically, the spinal column had not been damaged or severed. It had just cracked the vertebrae. My rib cage was damaged. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been torn off, and then the seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my insides. I was a mess. And I wasn't aware of that. All I knew is my son's crying. I've got to get to my boy. But that's when I became aware in a horrible way that no one else was crying. And I knew at the scene of the accident that both Tamara and Griffin were gone. They were killed instantly in the crash. And that's the darkest hell. That's the darkest hell I've ever been in, a man could ever be in. I mean, here I was, helpless. I can't move. I've got a hysterical 7-year-old. Half the family is gone, and I was driving the car. I just kept thinking, can't I get those 3 seconds back? What happened?
That was Jeff describing the accident on the Maybe God podcast with Eric Huffman. What happened next is simply profound. Listen to Jeff describe the moments following the accident.
At that point, I blacked out, and then I felt light come. Light. It was tangible light came and surrounded me, and it felt as if it was comforting me in this horrible, horrible moment. And it felt like I was rising above or rising above the trauma, the accident scene, literally like I was ascending above it. And then in that light, Tamara, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, and I don't share this to be morbid or graphic, but because she had reclined her seat back, the seatbelt had not restrained her properly. And she had suffered severe head trauma. That's what took her life. But in this light, and I was aware of that at the accident, and yet in this light, she was gorgeous. She was perfect. There was no trauma. She was beautiful. She was angelic. But she was emphatic with me. You got to go back. You got to go back. You can't stay here. You've got to go back.
Verbally speaking to you.
Verbally. She's verbally speaking to me. In fact, it was so physical. I mean, I know that sounds odd, but it was physical beyond physicality. Like I could taste her tears, and she was emotional. If she was hitting my chest saying, you got to go back. And we literally had a conversation where if I stayed with her, our little boy would be orphaned. And I knew Griffin, our youngest, had passed. He was not there in this instant. But we had a conversation, and we made the choice that I would come back. I gave my word, I'll go raise our boy. Oddly enough, I was comforting her. I said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say. Mm-hmm. And then we made a choice, and I made a choice to come back. And that's when it got really interesting, because as I made that choice and said this profound goodbye, suddenly I'm moving about a hospital. And I'm seeing the doctors, the patients, the nurses, the families of patients. Now, I have no concept of time in this bubble of light. I later found out that, yes, people arrived at the scene of the accident. Emergency services were called. They were able to get Spencer out of the car, my 7-year-old, and he was banged up pretty good. He had bruised his ribs and his wrist was cracked, but he physically walked away from the accident. Emotionally, he thought the whole family was gone. Mm. They had to extricate me from the car, and because of my injuries, they had to life flight me or airlift me to the nearest level 1 trauma center. I had no idea of any of that. I knew I'd crashed the car. I'd said the most profound goodbye I'd ever say. And here I was moving about the hospital, encountering the doctors, the patients. And yet as I saw them, and it's almost like I could see everything. I was aware of everything. I knew them. I mean, I knew their love, their joy, their hate, their challenges, their motivations. I knew them. It was almost as if I knew them like I knew myself. They were me and I was them. There was a profound oneness.
Were they seeing you?
No. I mean, and this is just a brief, moment in it. Like a nurse passed by me and she was completely unaware of me. But as she passed, I was acutely aware of her. I felt as if it was my own experience. I felt the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that she had experienced as a child. Now, how is that in a moment, But in that same instant, I saw her magnificence. Wow, look at what she's doing. She's here healing and serving. And everyone I saw, it didn't matter. The heroin addict to the saintly grandmother, I saw their magnificence. I felt their hearts. I knew them, and they were part of me. In fact, a biblical verse came to me, one I knew very well. It's the famous verse where Jesus said, "Inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of one of these, you've done it unto me." And I used to believe that was a nice verse about being nice, right? In this experience, there was a connection. There was a deeper knowing to what Jesus was saying there. I mean, they were me, I was them, and I realized what he was saying is, I am the beggar in the street. I am the man in prison. I am the stranger that's just looking for acceptance.
Over the next few weeks and days, Jeff experienced more and more near-death and out-of-body experiences. He described encountering his deceased father, who had passed away from cancer a few years earlier. He also experienced a life review, where he said he relived every moment of his life from the perspective of the people he had interacted with. He felt the emotions, the thoughts, both the positive and the negative. Jeff says he even met Jesus Christ and was told that he was loved unconditionally and that his life would have a purpose. During this time, Jeff's road to recovery would be long. He survived over 18 surgeries. Now, what makes most near-death experiences so easy to toss out to the rational person is that there's no way to verify that these experiences happen. What's fascinating about the case of Jeff is a relationship he would later form with a trauma physician who worked at the hospital where he was taken care of. That physician was Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, and this is his story. He states that he had just finished his rounds in the emergency room when he heard about a patient who was being brought in. A car accident. The patient had an older son with minor injuries, but the father had very serious injuries and would need surgery. The mother and toddler were dead on the scene, and that's when Rachel, an ER nurse, grabbed his arm. "Come see this," she said. "This man's wife is here." He said at the time he knew exactly what she meant. Dr. O'Driscoll and Rachel stood in the doorway. The room was loud, and a team of doctors were working to stabilize the patient. As they watched, Dr. Driscoll says that the sounds began to fade out. He couldn't hear Rachel speaking to him anymore, and he sensed a presence in the room. He said he then noticed a light, and in it was the form of a woman floating near the patient's bed. She had flowing, curly blonde hair and was dressed in various shades of white. Her form was almost transparent, and the look of her face was serene. She was vibrant, otherworldly, and he knew that this woman was Tamara. Dr. O'Driscoll then says that Tamara smiled at him as if she'd known him forever. He sensed peace and immense gratitude from Tamara for the doctors who were working to save the life of her husband. He said that she looked directly at him, back at her husband, and smiled. Shortly after this, everything seemed to return to normal. Dr. O'Driscoll could hear other physicians speaking, and he could hear Rachel again. "Did you see her too?" said Rachel. The patient's wife was gone. Rachel encouraged Dr. O'Driscoll to share what he had seen with the patient, and though he was reluctant, he ultimately agreed. Dr. O'Driscoll entered Jeff's room. He saw that his leg had been amputated, and he knew he was still fighting a serious infection, and on top of all of that, suffered from extreme emotional fatigue. He says that he let Rachel do most of the talking. She told him everything, the experience of a divine presence, and then seeing his wife in the room, and the feeling of gratitude that he had received from her. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "That sounds just like Tamara. Thank you for telling me." It was in this moment that Jeff felt safe enough to share his out-of-body experiences with Dr. O'Driscoll. It was then that the trauma physician and the patient exchanged information and became friends. And while this was the beginning of a friendship, it didn't mean the end of Dr. O'Driscoll's shared death experience. 20 years after the accident, Jeff was preparing to move out of town. And one evening, as Dr. O'Driscoll was in his house getting ready for bed, he says he felt the presence of God followed by a voice. And even though he had never met Tamara and never heard her speak, he knew it was her. And the message was simple. Don't lose touch with Jeff. Don't let anything interfere with your friendship. So he didn't. And even today, the two men often speak at engagements together. This case is fascinating on so many different levels and incredibly difficult to explain as a skeptic. If you're someone who believes that maybe Dr. O'Driscoll wanted to be involved with this case because of the potential for writing books and doing speaking engagements, then how would you explain the fact that he went and spoke with the patient without having any knowledge of the near-death experiences that Jeff Olsen had had? Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll spent 25 years as an emergency room physician. In that time, he practiced at a level 1 trauma center and even served as a department chair for 8 of those years. He was trained at the University of Utah School of Medicine and completed residency in Salt Lake City. Absolutely nothing about Dr. O'Driscoll's experience, background, or education inclines me to believe that Dr. O'Driscoll is some kind of quack. Perhaps what's most interesting about this case is that regardless how much research is done, you can search wherever you want, there's no explanation for shared death experiences. And these types of experiences are not limited to Dr. O'Driscoll. Hospice nurses and relatives of the dying often report very similar stories. According to research by Linda J. Griffith and Bruce Grayson, it's estimated that the near-death experiences are probably at around 5% of the American adult population. However, other studies indicate that that number may be as high as 15%. Unfortunately, though, little is known about how common a shared death experience occurs. Well, I want to thank you guys for listening to the story of Jeff Olsen. It means so much to us that you tune in and take this journey with us. If you guys like our content, we would love for you to head over to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm so grateful for all of you guys listening to the program, and feel free to reach out to us at the Sheol podcast at gmail.com if you have questions, if you have a story you want to share. We would love to hear it. At this point, it's difficult for us to release an episode more than every other week, but we're going to have episode 3 very soon, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys then.